Welcome back, everybody. You know we love to take these deep dives together. And today we're going to be diving into Exodus chapter 23. And for this one, we're going to be looking at the interpretation that's given on the website, My Christian Space. And, when I was looking at this chapter and kind of getting ready, it really struck me that a lot of what's being talked about here is this idea of like how ancient Israel was called to be different.
Yeah.
Like to stand out, to be a nation that reflected God's character to everyone around them, even if the people around them didn't really, understand or agree with it. And it just got me thinking, like, have you ever felt that way? Like you're called to live by a different set of rules, that maybe your values don't quite line up with what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of people wrestle with, especially if you're trying to live out your faith in a world that doesn't always share those same values. And I think that's what makes this chapter so fascinating, because it really gets into the nitty-gritty of what it means to be set apart, you know, to live differently.
Yeah. And it doesn't shy away from the hard stuff either.
Yeah.
Right? Like right off the bat in Exodus 23.
Oh, yeah, you go straight into like the legal stuff.
Yeah, verse 3, it says, "Do not favor a person's lawsuit simply because he is poor."
Right.
It's like, whoa, hold on. Don't let sympathy cloud your judgment.
Yeah.
Justice has to be blind to social status. But then just a few verses later, it throws you this curveball. It says you have to help your enemy.
Like what?
If you see your enemy's donkey, like, struggling, you got to help him out.
It's a pretty radical concept, right? It's
Yeah.
like, even if you don't like this person, even if they've wronged you, you're still supposed to treat them with dignity.
It's like it's not even about, whether or not they deserve it. It's about upholding this higher standard of, like, recognizing that every person has inherent worth.
Exactly. And that's a tough one to swallow sometimes, especially when our natural instinct is to be like, well, they did this to me, so why should I help them?
Right. It makes you wonder, how often are we actually living that out today? I mean, how many of us would actually go out of our way to help someone who's wronged us?
Yeah, that whole like love your enemies thing is a lot easier said than done. That's for sure.
Yeah, but then this idea of like being different, it pops up again. This time in how the Israelites were supposed to relate to their land.
Oh, you're talking about the Shemitah.
Yeah, the Sabbath year, like where they had to let their land just lie fallow.
Right. For 6 years, they could farm it, reap the harvests, do all the things.
Yeah, work it.
But every
Yeah.
7th year, they had to just let it rest, let the poor glean from it, let the animals graze freely.
Where you hit the reset button.
It's crazy on the whole system.
It's almost like they were building in this idea of sustainability into their economic model.
Right.
Which is so forward thinking for, an ancient society.
And that's just blowing my mind a little bit.
Yeah, it's like a built-in system that forces them to think about the long term, to care for the land and to care for the most vulnerable members of their society.
And speaking of rest, Exodus 23 also talks about the regular Sabbath, that weekly day of rest where even the animals get a break. Right. It's like this rhythm of work and rest is woven to the very fabric of their lives.
Yeah, it's not just an option. It's like a commandment.
It is. It's like God saying, look, I created you to thrive, not just to toil endlessly. Rest is essential. It's part of my design for a good life.
So it's like we've got justice, care for the vulnerable, rest, all these things. It's almost like building blocks for a whole different way of life.
It is. And then it gets even more interesting when we get to the section on festivals and offerings. Exodus 23 mentions these 3 major festivals: Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles.
And what's the big deal with these festivals? Were they just like big parties?
Well, they were definitely times for celebration and communal gathering, but, they had deeper meanings too. Passover, of course, commemorated the Israelites' escape from slavery in Egypt. It was a time to remember God's faithfulness, to celebrate their freedom.
And the other 2 feasts, the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Tabernacles, those were more tied to like the harvest seasons.
Exactly. The Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, celebrated the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And then the Feast of Tabernacles marked the end of the harvest season. So they were times to express gratitude for God's provision, to acknowledge their dependence on Him for, their sustenance.
So it's like they're weaving their faith into every aspect of their lives, from their legal system to their relationship with the land to even just their calendar,
Yeah, it's like a total worldview shift.
A whole different way of looking at the world.
And then you get these really specific details that show just how committed they were to living differently. Like, remember that verse about not boiling a kid in its mother's milk?
Yeah. What is that about? I always thought that was kind of random.
Right. It seems so out there. But at the time, boiling a kid in its mother's milk was actually a pagan practice. It was associated with fertility rituals and things like that.
Oh, so it was like a rejection of that.
Exactly. It was a way of drawing a line in the sand and saying, we're not going to follow the ways of the world, even in our pigeons.
So even their cooking had to reflect their faith.
Yeah, it's wild. It makes you think about our lives today, right? Like, are there things we do, even seemingly small things, that might be rooted in values or beliefs that we don't even realize?
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's like a challenge to examine our own lives and be like, wait, am I just following the crowd here?
Yeah.
Or am I actually living out my own convictions?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit because there's this other part in Exodus 23 that I wanted to make sure we talked about, which is this mysterious messenger that's mentioned in verse 20.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So it talks about this angel, or as some scholars translate it, messenger, that God sends to guide Israel. And this messenger has the power to forgive or not forgive wrongdoing.
That's a pretty big deal, right? Like, that's not just some random celestial being.
It makes you wonder if this is like a hint at the Messiah, even though this is centuries before Jesus was born.
Right. And the Hebrew word for angel, which is malach, can also mean messenger. So some scholars believe that this is actually a foreshadowing of Jesus.
Whoa, okay. So we're not just talking about a list of rules here. We're uncovering some pretty deep theological concepts.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion, you know? There's always more to discover.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about already. And we've only just scratched the surface of this messenger figure. So let's take a little break here, and when we come back, we'll delve even deeper into Exodus chapter 23. So we're back and still unpacking this whole messenger thing from Exodus 23.
It's fascinating, right? This idea that centuries before Jesus, you have this figure who's both powerful and merciful. It really gets you thinking about the continuity of God's plan, you know?
Absolutely, and it makes me want to dig even deeper into like the whole concept of the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, there's this other part of Exodus 23 that I wanted to circle back to, which is those blessings and boundaries that God lays out for Israel.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So, like, what's the deal with those? Is it just like follow the rules and you'll get rewarded kind of thing?
Well, it's definitely presented as a conditional covenant. Like God says, if you follow my ways, if you obey my commands, I'll bless you abundantly.
And those blessings are pretty enticing too, right? Like what we see in Exodus 23.25-26. He talks about health, prosperity, protection from enemies. Like, who wouldn't want that?
Right. It's like a picture of wholeness and flourishing. But it's not just about getting stuff from God, you know?
Right. It's not like a prosperity gospel kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about aligning your life with God's will, with his vision for a just and compassionate society.
And then there's that whole section about the boundaries of Israel's land, like
Mhm.
how God specifically defines their territory.
Right. It's like, this is your inheritance. This is where you belong.
It makes me think about how we define our own boundaries today. Not just like physical boundaries, but also emotional, spirit, even digital boundaries.
That's such a great point, because for the Israelites, those physical boundaries were about establishing their identity as a nation, a people set apart. But it also raises some questions for us today, like how do we navigate those boundaries in a world that's so interconnected?
Right, like Exodus 23.3233 specifically warns the Israelites not to make treaties with other nations or adopt their gods. They're even told to destroy idols.
It's like God is saying, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. You're called to be different.
But how do you hold on to your values, your convictions, without isolating yourself completely?
That's the tension, isn't it? How do we engage with the world without compromising who we are?
It's a challenge we all face, right? Whether we're talking about ancient Israel or our own lives today,
Absolutely.
this call to be different, to live by a higher standard, it's not easy.
No, but maybe that's the point. Maybe it's in the struggle, in the wrestling with these big questions, that we actually grow and become more like who we're meant to be.
It's like those boundaries, those lines in the sand. They're not just about keeping things out. They're also about protecting something precious, something worth fighting for.
Exactly. And what's more precious than living a life that reflects God's character? A life that embodies justice, compassion, faithfulness.
I love that. Okay, so we've come full circle, haven't we? From impartial justice to helping our enemies, to Sabbath rest, to living differently in a world that doesn't always get it. It's a challenging call, but also incredibly inspiring.
It is. It's like a blueprint for a life that matters.
So what are your final thoughts on all of this?
I think Exodus 23 gives us a framework for thinking about what it means to live a life of purpose. It's not about following a bunch of rules blindly. It's about understanding the heart behind those rules, the values they represent. And it's about finding ways to apply those values to our own lives, even in a world that's very different from ancient Israel.
I love that. So, dear listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into Exodus 23, we leave you with this. If you were tasked with creating a society that truly reflected God's character, what would it look like? What values or principles would you build it on?
Would it prioritize justice and compassion?
Would it embrace rest and sustainability?
Would it value truth and integrity above all else?
Big question, but we encourage you to wrestle with it, to dream big, and to see how those ancient principles might guide us toward a better future.
Until next time, may your deep dives lead you to deeper understanding, deeper faith, and deeper purpose.